Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to have a fairly brief event here, but I think it's going to be a very impactful event. I want to thank all of those that helped put this event together, which includes the Economic Alliance of Kankakee County, Kankakee County Chamber of Commerce, the Manteno Chamber of Commerce, Kankakee County Convention and Visitors Bureau, Midland States Bank, Catalyst, and the Kankakee Public Library. We are actually going to be filming this event, so probably in about a week we'll have it uploaded to the Economic Alliance of Kankakee County's website. So if you know of other business owners that might take advantage of this information or need some follow-up information after we're done with our presentation here, feel free to direct them to that site. But so several of us have been on some webinars, and I guess it was surprisingly some of the information that we've uncovered. As you know, we're really kind of in a boom situation in Kankakee County with all the jobs that are coming in, and certainly fortunate to be in that situation. But I think as we learn about what's going on throughout the rest of the United States, which eventually will include us as well, there are some threats that are coming down the lane that we need to be aware of, and how can we turn those threats into an opportunity. One of them really has to do, and I'll go over some statistics here in a minute, is the aging baby boomers that own businesses, and there's a startling number of those that are going to be in play, that are going to be retiring from their business or exiting their business, and we need to figure out a good way to have a plan to get around that. So some of the information I'm going to be sharing is actually from Ready for the Next Cities. They had a lot of their information compiled not only by themselves but also the Small Business Administration. I know the University of Illinois Extension referred to this as the same thing, and that is, will the silver tsunami sink your city? Meaning, as people age and business owners decide to retire, what's going to be the impact of their business closing and/or the employees that are leaving the employee of that business? Our point behind this whole conversation today is really preparing our city, Kankakee County, as well, to make sure that we're in the front of this and that we're helping business owners with the transition of their business and helping align them with people that can possibly buy their business and what next steps are. Today will be kind of a more high-level overview, but we will have information available for those that desire that. So just going by the statistics, and again, these are U.S.-wide, so there's 10,000 baby boomers that are reaching retirement age every single day. That's a pretty startling number, and that's expected to continue until the year 2030. 6 million of those baby boomers are actually going to retire in the next 1 to 5 years, which is a startling number. I think what surprised me even more is that boomers actually own 2/3 of the private businesses in the United States. So I'm going to go over some numbers here in a minute, but that's still a significant amount for Kankakee County if you think that 2/3 of the small businesses are owned by baby boomers that are on the verge of retiring. The next slide is going to show you that number actually doubles to 12 million baby boomers will exit their business in the next 5 to 10 years. Once again, these baby boomers that will be exiting their business own 2/3 of the businesses that are operating right now. So, but I think the one thing that was really alerted us to why we needed to mobilize to action here a bit is the fact and the statistic that only 1 out of 10 baby boomers have actually an exit program or a transition for their business. And I think that's where the real opportunity is, that we can turn a threat into an opportunity, and that is to get in front of those business owners that may be thinking that, I may be winding down in the next 5 or the next 10 years, and assisting them with what that transition would look like for their business and for a prospective person buying their business. The economic impact, to be honest with you, is extremely daunting. Some of the figures you can see here as well is that what would it look like if we could protect as much as 40% of the local businesses? Across the United States, the 40% of these businesses employ 34 million people across the United States. So if we survive them from the silver tsunami and allow them to have an exit strategy for somebody else to buy their business and keep that business running, it would save 34 million jobs. There's $13 trillion in business value that's being represented by nearly 40% of the economy of the subset that they were looking at. And 16.7 million boomer-owned, operated businesses are in the United States. So that's a significant number. And then again, to the right, as you can see, only 1 in 10 actually has an exit strategy for their business. I won't go into all the numbers on the right side, but I will cue in on a couple items here. Again, it talks about the 10% rule. What would matter if we made a difference of those 40% of those business owners by making sure that they had a successful exit strategy, knowing that only 1 out of 10 have the plan. So In the right side, they basically just took a test number of businesses of 1,000 business with an average total revenue of $1 million a year, $20,000 net income. And if we looked at being able to, I guess what that would translate to then would be the owner of the company, the wealth at risk, if you take the 1,000 times the net income and the wealth of that business, there's probably about $20 million in play. If you look at the community income that's at risk, if those all would go out of business, close shop, just sell their assets, and the business ceases to operate, the impact on those 1,000 businesses would be $325 million. That's a significant amount. So the idea is that there's a trickle-down effect not only between the business owners closing their business, selling their assets, but all the employees that work for that business owner, too, that would be impacted, and then the community that's being impacted by dollars that aren't being spent in the community as well. So the number that they had with the impact of being able to save 40% of these would be out of 182 successful transitions, 520 jobs preserved, $29 million in wealth gain instead of loss, and then $175 million in aggregate wealth preserved. So that's the key behind all of this, is not only to preserve jobs, but preserve wealth for that business owner that's worked, in a lot of cases, their whole life to work towards their retirement to make sure that they have the ability to be able to retire with a successful strategy for their business. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers, and I'll ask each one of them to kind of give a brief introduction of themselves, and then we're very pleased to have Matthew and Don Hemanover, who've gone through a transition period, and they'll talk a little bit about what that looked like, the time frame, and how they set themselves up for that successful transition. So, Scott Pigosh, I'll start with if you want to give yourself a little bit of your background.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Scott Pigosh. I'm the owner and wealth manager at S.A. Pigosh Financial Consultants in Manteno. I've been practicing financial advising, planning for nearly 14 years now. We help individuals and couples plan for retirement income planning. That also includes business owners. And so they're constantly approaching us for advice on what they can do within their business to help attract and retain employees, but then also to transition their business to the next generation or to get out altogether and sell their business. We specialize in retirement income planning. I got some of my team in the back I'd like to introduce real quick. Brandon Judicus, he's a certified financial planner for us. And then my wife, Kim Pigosh, is here. She's our chief operations officer. And then we have another lady, Colleen Wood, that works for us, and she's handles everything else at our office that we're not good at. So that's it.
Thank you, Scott. Jesse Erickson with Catalyst.
Hi, I own Catalyst. We do business advisory and assistance type services. So we help people with their financials, QuickBooks, different marketing strategies. We also do a lot of business planning. So I've been involved with a few businesses now that have gone through some form of purchasing from a previous owner, and it's why I'm here. It's been really tough to do that. A lot of businesses that you would know don't have really great plans in place. It makes it a big challenge for the new owner. It makes a big challenge for even getting down the path of selling the business once you retire. So.
Don from Hemanover Construction.
Don Hemanover Construction. I guess I'm a survivor. I'm 1 out of the 10. I'm a boomer, and we've successfully managed to move twice now the business from one generation to the next. So we have a small, often referred to as a mom-and-pop construction company. We do local residential work. We have a cabinet shop which does some commercial and residential work too. So.
And Matthew?
And I'm the fortunate third generation, which is always the one that tanks the business after two generations of success. So fortunately, I feel like I've got big shoulders. But I am a graduate of Illinois State University. I know there's a former Redbird in the room here with me. So we are excited to be a part of this and share our story with you guys.
Thank you. I guess I should have introduced myself, but I was waiting for the slide. So my name is Scott Snavely. I'm a market president for Midland States Bank, market president too. I've been back in the community 6 years, community I love. I was born and raised here. Moved away when I was younger, kind of cut my teeth in banking for a while for a couple larger banks, and then had an opportunity to come back to work with Midland States Bank. And I think my whole philosophy is the bank is that we're here to serve our community, and anything that we can do to help make a positive impact in our community is why we're here. Fortunate to be able to collaborate with the expert panel that we have here to feel like we can really make an impactful difference, I think, in our community and our economy by getting in front of what we're talking about with the silver tsunami. So what I'd like to do next is have Don and Matthew just talk a little bit, make sure your microphone's on, about kind of what time period was your transition period. When did you begin it or think about it, and kind of what were your steps of transitioning the business over to Matthew?
Well,
Yep.
my transition from my father to myself went rather smoothly, as I believe it has between Matthew and I. My father started the business back in '36 and grew it to a very respectable business. I left the community for about 7 years between school and an overseas stint, came back, met his mom, and realized I was going to be living in the area. Never disliked the business, and fortunately I feel really lucky and fortunate as I grew up into that business, and a lot of other in this profession, a lot of other father-son combinations were out there. And I had a lot of people ask me when I was younger, how do you get along with your dad so well? I said, well, we've argued about a lot of things, but we always seem to be adults about it, get over it, and come out on top. So as he and I have, it's always great to have new energy, new generation come in, new excitement, new things that they bring to the table. He and I have had I think a very amicable agreement to transition the business. Unfortunately, Scott, we were able to do it without your services, so. But it has worked out very well. I was thinking of what I would be on the other side at one point in time. How am I going to get out of this business, and what am I going to do? I knew it wasn't going to last forever. I wasn't going to last forever. Fortunately, as Matthew married, family developed, worked up in Chicago for 7 or 8 years with Pulte Homes, he made the decision to come back and join us, which was a good day in my life. That made the transition pretty simple, actually. All I needed was some assurance that I'd have a place to go every morning and an office to sit in if I needed to, and the financial transition was, I feel, pretty simple in our case. I said, you can pay me a little bit of money until I die, and you can have everything. So that wasn't quite that simple, but it's kind of how it worked, and I think we're very, very fortunate to have been able to work that out without. There were some hard assets that we transitioned over financially and payment-wise. You pay me, I pay you, and kind of move the money around the table. And all I was looking for was some kind of an income stream, and as long as I can keep him going in business, I've got that. So that's how it worked for us at this point. He may have another viewpoint of that, but it has worked out well. We've been very, very fortunate, I think, all 3 generations to be able to move the business along for 84 years now. We're hoping we get at least another 16 so we can make it 100. I hope I'm around to see it.
Matthew?
So one of the things that I recognized almost immediately is I'm one of 4 children in our family. And I have 2 younger brothers and an older sister. And I'm really the only one that had any kind of an interest in the construction company, in working for the company as an employee and eventual owner. My concern in that whole realm was, what if my brother decides 10 years from now that he decided that he wants to be a carpenter again, and my sister decides that she wants to come work in a marketing aspect of the business. That I'm saying I wouldn't be happy to have in any of them, but obviously with their namesake, it would be easy enough for them to want a piece of the pie as well. So Dad mentioned we had some hard assets in physical properties and buildings and things that made the company function, storage facilities, equipment, things like that. So I took it upon myself, and with an agreement between Dad and I, was to move those into my ownership personally, and to, not that I'm trying to cut my other siblings out of the picture altogether, but I wanted to ensure my own family's stake in the company, and to make sure that we were going to be able to function and manage the company as would need to be throughout the time. So we had a lot of conversations and discussions about that. The other thing that I thought was a beneficial part and a crucial part, and I think our panelists here are going to talk to that, is having the right team of people in place. When it came to discussions about how we're going to finance things, or how we're going to transition property names and not put a massive tax burden on Dad and or the business, that was definitely a part of the puzzle that we needed our lawyers, our accountants, our banking team, to make sure that we understood what the ramifications are. I mean, we kind of came to that team and said, here is what we want this to look like in the end result. How do we not bury Dad in capital gains taxes or things like that, and how do we not bury the business in a number of fees and taxes that aren't necessary either. So we really had to rely on those team members to really help us walk through that entire process and help us to lay that plan out.
We appreciate you sharing that. It's very good information, and we'll certainly open this up to questions at the end here. We do have a couple questions we're going to ask the panel here. As you heard from the Hemanovers, that was a kind of a family-to-family transition for business succession planning. There are other types, such as owner-financed business succession planning. There are owner-seller to buyer succession planning. So it can take a lot of twist and turn, and I think, as Matthew alluded to, having the right team around you, such as a CPA, an attorney, your bank that you're working with, to make sure you've got the right transition of assets, you've got somebody that works on valuing the business. But the first question, I'll have Jesse jump in, and if anybody else wants to answer this as well. How important do you feel it is for business planning, including for having an exit and succession plan for small business?
Vital. Most businesses I deal with don't have a business plan at all, even before they get to a point where they need succession planning. But probably my greatest example of this, and I've asked for permission to talk about it a little bit. So I worked with Nana's Cakery recently to switch owners. Wanda, who had owned the business, started the business, she'd had it for about 10 years, wanted to transition out. And she didn't have any family to take over or anything like that. So we did, luckily, come across someone that did want to take over the business, though him and his family was not privy to baking. They hadn't done it before. They'd worked in some other businesses, but it was a big challenge. Nana did not have a plan in place whatsoever, and one of the biggest challenges we faced was we originally wanted to get a loan to purchase the business. As we started to dig into what financial documents and records there were available, we found a lot of inconsistencies and things that just weren't explainable to anyone that was going to give them a loan. It's not really her fault. She just didn't know what to do, didn't have any help. And so luckily she was willing to do some owner financing, so we kind of switched models to an owner financing model. And that's been going okay. But again, there's no procedures in place, nothing written down, how they do sales and how they, bake certain different kinds of baked goods or anything like that, how they operate, what kind of employees they need, and what they should be able to do. We've been very fortunate that a lot of the employees have stayed around since the transition. If we didn't have some of those ladies, we'd probably be up the creek in a couple different areas. So just having some of those procedures in place, whether that's an actual business plan is kind of irrelevant, but just having some written documentation about how we actually do business here is extremely important. I'm actually the son of someone that owns a business as well, and he's not old enough to transition yet or anything like that, but I constantly find out new things that he assumes that I know that I don't. And that's one of the other challenges, too, is assuming that the person taking over should just know, or that you said it, or anything like that. It's easy to forget those things that are verbalized. So as much that can be written as possible is really the best business plan, I think, in succession planning. So.
Don?
I might add to that, particularly we're a subchapter S company, cash accounting, so that legally, I'm not saying illegally, but it legally allows you to massage the money towards the end of the year. Accrual basis, you can't quite do that as easily. But in trying to plan for your situation, if you are looking or planning some kind of an exit strategy, don't massage the books too much. You got to show that the company's profitable if somebody's going to buy it. If that's not an interest or an intent, you can, as probably most business owners, if you are business owners in here, realize you can push debt and expenses and income from one year to the next and change the numbers slightly in your favor. It's going to eventually come home to rest. But, he and I talked about that. We were doing that, and I started thinking, I better quit doing that, because if he hadn't showed up, I'm going to have to show that this is a viable business, you know. So.
Yep. Absolutely.
No, that's a good point. And there are a lot of things, if you're selling to a partner or a party that's not a family member, that goes into business valuations. One of them is, you know, kind of the integrity of the accounting methods in the books, but also the assets that would be acquired. Some of these might have goodwill to it, which are not really hard assets that you need to consider. But Jesse, I'll let you answer this first as well too. What are some of the pitfalls that you've kind of seen in business succession planning, or things that could possibly go wrong if they're not planned properly?
The entire deal can fail. I had a few of those as well. One of which recently, the owner still is running the business. It will probably just end up closing when he retires. There's nothing there of value on paper to make any sort of real transfer, and he doesn't have a family member to take over. I'm working on a deal right now too, where they gave us a purchase price, and started looking at the books, and I was like, "Oh, so you own the building then for this price, right?" And no, we don't own the building; we just lease it. And start going through the assets, and no, we don't have a whole lot of inventory, not a whole lot of assets. We have sales though, and the sales are fairly stable, but compared to the value, and when you look at the bottom line profit, it just doesn't make any sense for that value. Now, if they had done some different things, maybe that value makes sense. But one of the important things I think a lot of business owners kind of miss is, as you're preparing for this, it isn't as clear as, well, we've made a lot of sales over the years, so therefore it's worth X amount. There has to be assets, there has to be tax returns that show profit, to your point. And that's just not how it usually works on a year-to-year basis. So you really do have to prepare a few years in advance. And one of the issues with the loans that I deal with is that they usually will look at least 3 years of tax returns. And if the tax returns show, $1,000 of profit, that's not very good. And they can't lend to that. So,
good point. This one I'm going to have addressed to Don and Matthew, but what was your way of effectively communicating not only to your employees but also to maybe some vendors or other customers or clients that you were working with, that there would be a transition with the business?
I think it's been a bit of a gray area still. We still get questions, or I get questions. Hey, your dad's still part of the business? What's going on with him? What's he doing? So I can say honestly, I don't know that we've done an excellent job of creating a line in the sand. And honestly, I think at this point we're still sharing a lot of responsibilities. We're still sharing a lot of roles and duties within the company. I tell the story that to a lot of people that he says as well is, he says he feels like he's semi-retired because he only is working 35 or 40 hours a week instead of 65 or 70. So that transition for him has I think taken a little bit of a step back, but to a lot of people, working 40 hours a week is still a full-time job. But when you've taken that step from a 60-hour work week or a 70-hour work week, that's a partial retirement. So the actual communication to employees and to our clients is something that we're not, I would say we've probably struggled with a little bit, and has probably not really been a definitive line in the sand of sorts. So we can, I'll let you talk to that as well.
Only thing I'd like to add to that is in our particular business, based a lot on reputation and past referrals, I experienced it when I was transitioning from my father to myself. He's experienced. It's like any restaurant you go into, you want the owner there. You want the owner to, and there are still people and clients that don't want to talk to him, they want to talk to me. Not a lot, but a few, because I've dealt with them for the last 35 or 40 years. I also dealt with that with my father. How we transition from that, it just, I mean, he's proven himself every day and building the confidence in those older clients and customers. And I love to see all the people he brings in the office. I got to introduce myself to them because I don't know.
No, that's a good point, and obviously that's probably an ideal situation where, and I see it in the dental industry and in the doctor industry, where they'll bring somebody in and maybe work in the business for a year before they actually take it over, so they get to meet all the clients or the patients or whatever, and it seems to be a lot more of a seamless process. You know, the big concern for somebody buying a business, obviously, is that business is quasi-trademarked by that owner, and that's the personality of that business, and now all of a sudden somebody comes in and starts to change things that could have a significant effect on the revenue stream and also the bottom line profit as well. I guess my other question would go to Jesse as well, too, is how strong, and we talked about a little bit about this, do accounting practices impact business valuation and their ability to secure your loans and really just the integrity of all the financials? I know you talked about it a little bit about the importance of making sure they've got, CPA qualified and they've got all their books in order and not just receipts that are in a box or something like that. Can you just touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, I kind of spoke about that already. But not just the year-end taxes, but just the integrity of the books, like on a month-to-month basis, is really important. I've seen a lot of businesses that like to do their own bookkeeping, which I would not normally recommend. There are very few business owners I feel like should do their own bookkeeping, because things just kind of get moved around or put in categories that make sense to them, but not necessarily the rest of the world when you look at them. And that's been kind of a struggle with quite a few businesses. And then also just ensuring that you're paying yourself correctly. You can get away with a lot of different things paying yourself, and some of those things aren't even illegal. But if you can't explain that well in your books, and someone can't take that up without even talking to you about it, and just understand where that money's really going, that's been a big issue for us in a couple different situations. I think that's probably the main
yeah. And this would be for you and Scott as well, just in your dealings. How do you see the transition, kind of the steps, not necessarily the timeline, but how does it normally work when a business owner decides they want to transition an exit strategy? How do you see that play out as far as them preparing for it? How do they go about trying to find a viable buyer for the business, and what's been your experiences with that?
Well, I think just spending the time to contemplate that and consider that, you owe it to yourself as a business owner. You spend your entire life building the business and putting everything you have into building the business, and yet it seems like very little time is ever put into how that business will be transitioned. So spend the proper time that it deserves to think about that and what that's going to look like, because while you might build a business for 30 years, it might only take you a year to transition it or shorter, but think about the end result in mind before you start to think about what that transition will look like, rather than pigeonholing yourself into a position and then realizing that doesn't work for you financially, and then saying, oh, I don't want to do it, and getting cold feet and backing out of it. So, we see situations where people will, come to a price and then meet with us and realize that price doesn't work for them from their own personal financial standpoint through retirement, and then they start asking for the buyer to pay for country club memberships or gas or health insurance or cell phone bills, and then it just gets to be too much, and they're like, I'm not paying for your retirement, I'm buying a business here. So make sure that you have a realistic idea of what that valuation is. I think Jesse mentioned that, as well as, having the proper books or having somebody else, evaluate the business other than yourself, because you probably are biased as to what the value is, because, somebody who's coming in and purchasing the business is not going to buy it for your blood, sweat, and tears. They're buying it for the profits that it's generating and the enterprise value. And so make sure that you're realistic about what that number is, and then determine if that number will work for you longer term. If not, it might be, hey, I need to hold off on this for another year or 2 or 3 before I can transition this and go into retirement. So every transition cycle is going to look different. We have 3 business owners that we're working with right now that are looking at transitioning their business. All 3 of them are in very different situations. One wants out completely. The other sold part of their business to an employee, and they'll be transitioning the other part once that piece is paid off. And then the third is looking to sell the business but keep the real estate to provide income for them throughout retirement. So it can depend on what your end situation looks like to determine what transition might be best for you. So start with the end in mind and then kind of work yourself backwards, I think, would be the key takeaway there.
That's a good point. And I think studies have shown a lot of people, they work their whole life for their business, and they think that is their retirement, the value of their business, and then they go to sell their business and find out by not properly being prepared, their business is worth 3/4 or 1/2 of what they thought it would be. So I think the thought behind that is what kind of income do you need to continue to survive on that maybe you've been making on your business, which would all go into this planning of it. And then Scott, maybe you can speak of this as well, where maybe business owners have, for a better word, put all their eggs in one basket with the valuation of their business, but maybe have not put money into a retirement plan that business owners can do. If you could speak to that as well while they're operating the business.
Yeah, I think Jesse mentioned that, paying yourself properly, right? I mean, making sure that you are taking care of yourself first. And, I think if you're starting out the business, everything's getting piled back into the business, and you get stuck in that routine of never saving for your own personal retirement like somebody would if they're not a business owner and they're just an employee. So making sure that you're saving yourself to supplement what you're going to get in return for your business down the road. I think, we talked about pitfalls. I think a lot of times, we talk about protecting that value. People will ultimately a lot of times do some type of installment sale because they want to drag this out and they want to get this income over, a 3, a 5, 7, 10-year period to supplement their income. But if everything is now transitioned to the new purchaser, you need to protect your interest in there still. You probably 3 years later, after being out of the business completely, if something happened to that buyer, you don't want to be jumping back into that business and start to run the business. So make sure that you protect the life of the person who is purchasing the business. That way, if something happens to them, you're going to get paid the remainder of what your installment sale purchase price agreement was. So keep that in mind to protect that value as well.
Good point. This is for Matthew and Don. So you're going through the transition, which is obviously a process. How did that, if it did impact your business while you were still trying to operate the business to try and work through all this transition? And were there any bumps in the road that you didn't anticipate that you kind of ran into while you're going through the process?
None whatsoever.
He doesn't want to know about all the bumps. I think some of the bumps and headaches that we faced were just, I think, again, I'm going to go back to the team of people that we had help us through this. Some of those team members again, had a 25, 30-year relationship with Dad and his interest in the business. And I didn't have any relationship with them. So there was some questions that came to mind in my head as to are we attacking this properly with my best interest in mind, and was it not just for his interest? And we had a lot of conversation about that, and then my wife came into the conversation, and we had more conversation about it. And so, we're a family business, and it was one of those things that really I think it helped us grow closer together, because we were able to have those open, candid, hard conversations about what does happen if we're setting up this 5 or 6 or 10-year plan. What happens if in year 5 out of our 10-year plan you cease to exist? What happens then? And we had to have a hard conversation about that. And what happens to this contract that we have in place? So, it's not always the fun conversations about, or you're going to be here for the next 25, 30 years, and I would be more than happy to have that. But what if? So it forced us to really have some deeper conversations about the what ifs and what could happen. So I think that was not necessarily a roadblock, but something to discuss.
It was well said. If there were any other bumps, it wasn't maybe because of the transition. It was just because of generational. The old guy is stuck in his way, and the new guy has a bunch of ideas, and most of them were all pretty good. He just had to convince me of them. He's still trying to convince me of something. So, but that wasn't necessarily the transitional part of it. But what he said was very true. We had a lot of hard discussion about all the what-ifs, and I think we got most of them fairly well answered. There's always going to be a what-if that will come up that you hadn't expected, but I would call them bumps, not roadblocks.
Yeah, I think it kind of echoes what they've said, is that communication is really key. What I've found often is that what one person says is not construed the same way when that other person hears it. And ensuring that you're really all on the same page. And that's something that I still work in my own dad's business, and we still struggle with, is just because I heard it one way doesn't mean that's how he wanted it done, or how we are supposed to do it, or even understanding just the facts of the business. This is what it is, and really making sure those things are clear. And that's why I kind of go back to even if you do have verbal conversations, writing a lot of it down, because that seems to clear up a lot of the miscommunication. I think that helps pretty often. And I was thinking about another business that I helped kind of transition, and also I think it's important to make sure that you're ready to transition the business, whether that be to a family member or another. If you really can't let go, that's going to be just a pain for everybody. And sometimes you're kind of forced to let go, but if you're planning ahead, just make sure that you do know exactly how long that year plan is, and that you are going to be ready to let go of the business and let go of different things. Because the new person isn't going to do everything like you did. It's going to be different. And that's okay in a lot of ways, as long as you're willing to accept some of those new ideas and talk through them. And if you don't see yourself as the kind of person that can do that, maybe, I hate to say this, but closing the business sometimes might be a better option. Or selling it to somebody that you don't know and can't get emotionally frustrated with might be a better option for you. So just really consider what your situation is and how it's going to work for you is really important.
How much should a business owner be looking a little bit at the timing of the market? So if you're in a robust economy versus, you start seeing a recession or something coming, how would that impact the valuation of that business and the timing of their exit and succession planning?
I think that what they should consider more so is the emotional side, like Jesse mentioned, is are they emotionally ready to detach themselves from the business? Because, multiple studies show that the happiness of yourself after your working career is based a lot on whether or not you were the one in charge of kind of making the decision to get out of your current working situation, as opposed to somebody telling you it's time to go on. And so if you're emotionally ready, I think that's the bigger factor in making that decision of when you should be looking to transition. The economy is going to change all the time, and so I think that that's out of your control. What is in your control is whether or not you're financially ready to do it and emotionally ready to do it, and then just start that process. And however long it takes, it takes, because it will take varying times for varying sizes of businesses and what each the complexities of each of those businesses that are involved. So.
I'm going to cover, in case people are thinking about, okay, I'm going to sell my business, but how do we transfer the assets or sell the assets? If it's a family business, sometimes it's just a question of moving assets into somebody else's name. But if you're selling it to an outside person or an outside buyer, in this case here, you might have commercial real estate to sell. You might have equipment to sell. You might have operating lines that are set up. And the person that's buying your business, a lot of these things aren't assumable, so they're going to have to be able to have access to that same type of financing. So if you have real estate, we'll need to make sure that it's valued and that they're paying for the real estate what you feel it's worth and what you want to get out of it. The equipment side is big. I've seen some business owners where, especially probably in the dental industry, maybe sometimes in the doctor industry, where you've got younger professionals that are coming up that are used to the latest, greatest equipment, and they'll make a step towards actually upgrading some of their equipment, knowing that they're going to find a more viable buyer coming in that's used to using that technology versus maybe equipment that they've had for 20 or 30 years that's going to be hard for somebody to come into. And then I think the biggest thing is that we didn't really talk about, depending on how long the business has been there, as I said, it has the owner's personality, it has their trademark. There's what we call goodwill. So a lot of businesses that has had a name associated with it that has value to that name, that they continue to go back to that business because they say that food's going to be the same, it's going to be great, it's going to be the same auto sales company or something like that. So they call that goodwill. An owner occasionally will put goodwill into the equation. As a bank, it's technically not financeable because it's not a hard asset. It's not real estate, it's not equipment. But we do have ways around that depending on how much the new buyer puts as far as a down payment. But I know on my next slide I talk a little bit about SBA financing. We use 504 quite a bit on not only new construction but refinances of commercial properties where somebody can have as low as 10% or 15% down. 7As is perfect for equipment financing and other types of financing where somebody's got to be a little bit leveraged up on the front end if they don't have significant cash infusion. And then there's obviously a couple alternatives as well. If somebody's had a bit of a troubled past with credit or whatever, Community Reinvestment Fund obviously is a viable option, as well as Axiom. I know Jesse's worked with them as well. But I think our whole point is that if we have a business owner coming to us saying, I'm ready to develop an exit and succession plan, we have an answer for you, or we can put a team together that can help you or another business owner that you may know to work towards that exit strategy. I mean, our goal is twofold. Number one is to ensure that business continues to operate, the employees continue to have jobs, but as importantly is that a business owner that sells the business realizes the wealth that they were hoping to get out of that, and they realize it while they're in Kankakee County so they can invest it with local investment companies. So a little bit selfish about just what we want to see to continue to happen in our community, and how we can, again, the numbers are staggering as far as what we're going to see as people transitioning out with baby boomers. And again, keep in mind, 1 out of 10 have a plan, and that's going to be problematic if we don't reach out to more business owners. So I'm going to talk about next steps here in a minute, but maybe Scott or Jesse kind of talk a little bit about options when somebody decides to do an exit plan or a succession plan. One of them is obviously they can stay on as an employee, they can cash in the business, or...
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, we have 3 different business owners that we're just currently working with right now, and all 3 of them have a different vision of what that looks like for them. But I would say that, it's a very emotional thing too. So the financial side can be figured out by crunching numbers, but there's an emotional aspect to it as well. And a lot of times they'll want to stick around to kind of protect that emotional side just in case, like, hey, if I go cold turkey, am I going to be okay with that? I don't know, right? And so they'll a lot of times want to stick around for a certain number of years to kind of continue to divest themselves emotionally from their business that they've spent so long investing in. So they will kind of do that over time. And so, there's that way of doing it. You can sell it to existing employees. I would say that if you've identified somebody that is your person of interest, that person might have been the right person 5 years ago, but maybe situations have changed and they're no longer the right person. So continue to consider who that person is that you should be looking to transition that business to. But I would say, an installment sale is probably one of the most common ways of doing that. Sometimes it's done with financing. Sometimes it's done with the profits out of the business are used to pay back to that seller. And that's a way of doing it without financing. But either way is viable. I would say, lastly, I know we're finishing up here, but before you enter into a formal agreement, you should also consider the tax ramifications of it. I know Matt and his dad had talked about this, but if you've already signed, sealed, and delivered and everything is done, it's very hard to do tax planning at that point. So you need to be kind of considering what your options are and talking to the right people before you get yourself into that final agreement, because usually once you're there, it's too late. But there's ways for you to get very good, favorable tax situations and still receive income from your business sale. But you got to do that planning beforehand. So strongly consider that before you enter into a formal agreement there.
I'd say if you're a business that you think maybe 3 to 5 years down the road you're getting ready to exit or have a succession plan, or if you know another business owner that may not be here today, reach out to that person. Like I said, we'll have the video up on the Economic Alliance website. But I think there's a couple questions that if you're in that situation you'd want to ask is, what is your exit strategy and your time frame? And that'll answer your question whether you have an exit strategy. The second one is, do you have a plan, and what does that plan look like? I think as critical as Scott, Jess, and Hemanover's mentioned is who's involved in your transition team. I mean, don't go it alone. Generally, if you've got some professionals or people that are know a lot more in this field, such as CPAs, accountants, attorneys, consulting firms, or whatever, that can even help you find buyers. That's a critical thing, because I think that's a lot of when people look at transitioning or exiting out, where am I going to find a pool of buyers for my business? Which is the next question, is who would be your prospective buyers? And then, is your business ready to sell? Do you have your financial house in order with all your quarterly interims or your annual tax returns or whatever to get a great valuation for it, which is, I think, what everybody wants when they want to exit or sell their business. So unless you guys have any final comments, I'll entertain questions from anybody in the audience that you might have about this. And
I have an audience,
Sure.
question for you. As
Sure.
a banker, we've all mentioned how important financial records are. And there's 2 or 3, 4 ways to value a small, privately held business. As a banker, as somebody coming into you, what's your most favorable report? What type of evaluation? You mentioned goodwill, you mentioned cost of sales, you mentioned tax returns. If you're asking somebody to prepare, what would be your favorite valuation?
Yeah, I think a couple things we look at, and it's probably threefold. Number one, the tax returns are going to be the tell-all about the top-line revenue. That'll give us some idea of a lot of businesses, have valuations based on top-line revenue. What's the bottom-line income stream? Whoever's taking over the business, and depending on how much they have to leverage up to buy the business, we got to make sure that the business is still going to cash flow at an adequate amount if the new buyer's taking on debt and the seller didn't have debt. So that would be one thing to look at. I think if you have interim financials that shows accounts receivables and other things, it gives us a better, deeper look at what the cash flow is of the business. And of course that becomes, whether it's account receivable or account payable, either becomes an asset or a liability. So we're kind of looking at what are lendable items. Is there real estate? If there's not, is there equipment? If not, is there accounts receivable? What are the accounts payable? So we're really kind of looking at the tax returns and then any financial statements that would show assets, liability, and then other statements that we could dig a little bit deeper into that shows basically the cash flows of the business so we can better understand that. But again, there's certain ways to value it, either based on the hard assets of the business, a multiplier of what the gross sales are, and then again, the intangibles, which would be the goodwill and what we look at with that, and that determines, depending on how big that is, whether we bring in SBA. So hopefully that answers your question.
You're
Yes.
making me nervous while you ask that question.
Lisa.
Yes, for Jesse, for actually anybody, but specifically,
I mean, my favorite quote is to stop working in your business and work on your business. I think as business owners that are past the beginning stages, which is just the first few years, I think we all struggle with that, whether you're succession planning or not. But as you move towards succession planning, I mean, I think again, every business is different. If it's a 3-employee company, you probably only need a year. My dad's company is close to 50 people. I wish he would start right now. But I think, honestly, for him, I think it would take him a good 5 to 10 years to be comfortable with it, to have passed on all the information that we really need, and to also make the employees comfortable with it. Again, kind of the employee stake in that is when you're a service-based business where your entire income streams depend on your people, and they are getting transferred over to especially a son who they don't know as much, and might be younger than them in some cases. I think that's a real challenge for some people. They really struggle with that. We actually hired a guy a few years ago that came from a company that had been transitioned from father to son, and he had left specifically because of that. He did not like the new owner. So I think it does depend on the size and kind of how close-knit some of the employees are, but if you're a medium-sized business, which I can kind of consider over 20 people, 5 years minimum, I think, would be the safest bet. And obviously, that doesn't happen very often, but that would be my preference. With Nana's, we had 6 months, and that was definitely not enough time. We're making it work, but that was definitely not enough time.
Other questions? Stacy?
We talk a lot about planned succession, but what about those instances where things in life happen? What are best tips? I know we all want to be prepared, but what's the Band-Aid for that succession plan when you really need to make a big life change? Anyway.
You talking about the owner, the original owner, having a life event? Yeah, I mean, we talk about that with clients that are business owners. I mean, you have to protect yourself. A lot of times that might involve having some type of insurance plan where you have a disability insurance policy or a buy-sell agreement, maybe more likely if there's a partner involved, to where they own policies on each other if something happens to the other, and there's nothing in place. The person who passed away, the spouse might be knocking on the business door the next day saying, "What are we doing today?" And I don't think the other owner is going to appreciate that too much. So they always say, well, it's too expensive to do that. Well, it's really expensive if that happens and there's nothing in place. So, and sometimes it can almost cripple the business. And so having that in place it's the foundation of any business owner's financial livelihood, to making sure that you have that in place. So, and as I mentioned, even if you enter into an agreement to sell and it's over a period of time, that business owner that sold should be protecting that purchaser, that new buyer's life interest, because if something were to happen to them, they're likely not going to want to jump right back into that business and start to take that over. They're out. They've disconnected emotionally, physically, everything. So they would much rather probably be in a situation where they could get paid for the remainder of that installment price and then, disconnect themselves completely from that situation. So.
Scott brings up a very good point. I mean, as a business owner, regardless of succession planning or exit strategies, you got to be conscious about what if I step off a curb and I get hit the next day. I mean, I had a conversation with a pretty successful general contractor, not necessarily in this market. We had an attorney there. We had wealth management there, which is what Scott does, and started talking to him about how he can convert his business into an annuity stream. And he said, well, I can just take my contractor's pension. And I said, well, that's all good in case, unless something happens to you. And he goes, well, I've got about $2 million in receivables. My employees will just collect that for me and give it to my family. And I looked at the attorney and I said, how often do you really think employees collect the money for their deceased employer and turn it over to the families? And he said that never happens. So you've got to be careful that you may have some great loving employees, but when the owner dies, if there's not something set up to help protect against that, to put that into an estate or a trust or something like that, you're leaving it to chance, and people will raid the business. I mean, it happens.
And I will add real briefly, you always think that it'll never happen to you, but we're currently working with a situation, a family where it did happen, where their two brothers were owners. One of them passed away unexpectedly. We told them to have this plan in place, have this plan in place. All of a sudden he comes, wants to do it, and then he dies of a massive heart attack. So it has not only financially hurt the existing brother from a business standpoint, but it has also torn their family apart because there's no valuation to the business. They think it's worth this, and they're wanting to pay this. And the families are now completely separated, not only the extended families, but also the immediate family of their survivor. So it's not just good financially, but from an emotional standpoint, it's absolutely necessary. So,
One or two more questions. All right. See, the next steps, and I guess this is what I think we're looking for is a panel here, and as for all those that help put this together, and that is we really want to start working on the identification and engagement stage. So I think we determined there's probably, believe it or not, 7,000 small business owners that are in Kankakee County, which include contractors, but 7,000 people either work for themselves or work for a small business owner, and that's a significant amount. If you look at the numbers that I showed earlier, and how many of those could be baby boomers and how many of those don't have a succession plan, that's a significant number of people. So I think our thoughts are to try to get the word out early and often to identify and start getting those engaged, and then also having them engaged in analysis and education, kind of like we're doing today. How do you go about your transition and exit strategy? How do you go about evaluating your business? Who needs to be on your team so we can get that a little bit more formalized? And then from there, it actually goes into what we call solutions road mapping. So here's what their roadmap looks like for them to exit their business strategy, and these are their baselines or their points that they need to reach to get to that. And then solution implementation. And then, as important as anything, as we said, is that we want to preserve the business. We want to preserve the employees that are working for the business. But as important, we want to preserve the wealth for the business owner that's going to be exiting that business and to make sure that, they're able to accumulate the wealth that they were looking forward to for all the years that they worked for that business. So anything else you guys gentlemen, you want to add before? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for all your time. And again, I think Lisa said the Economic Alliance of Kankakee County will have this on their blog, the video. So I would ask you that if you know any other business owners, or if you're a business owner yourself that might be interested in thinking about exiting your business, reach out to one of us, Lisa, myself, Jesse, Scott, and I appreciate the Don and Matthew's input. This is certainly valuable information since you've gone through it firsthand, and just appreciate everybody's time today, and have safe travels and a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for your time.